I am pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Our speaker is Lexi Young. Lexi is co-owner of Young Gardens, a design professor, a mom to children and chickens, and a true believer in the power of gardening. Gardens are a place to better our world, to build community, to strengthen our relationship with nature, and to nurture ecologies. So we are very excited to have Lexi here with us this evening. I will go ahead and let her take over, and I will see you all at the end of the webinar.
All right. Thank you so much, Alicia. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here with you guys. I'm flattered to be invited to share what I know. I am going to talk today about pollinators and their um, sort of how we build gardens for them. All right, so today I am going to talk to you about pollinator gardens and how we can create a refuge for the smallest of the creatures among us. Um, so just to give you some idea what you can expect here. Hopefully. All right, so I do have a table of contents. Start with just a welcome, talk about who are the pollinators and why they need your garden. Um, Sort of give us a sort of Midwest contextualization of that. Talk about designing a garden for pollinators, share a few case studies, and then starting your own pollinator garden. Just a few little tips and tricks, and then I'll have a closing with a call to action for you, and then I'll take your questions. So I'm going to try to stay on target to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, but we'll see how I do. So first of all, this is me. I'm Lexi Young. I am the co-owner and the designer at Young Gardens. You can find us online at younggardensiowa.com. I am proud to be a graduate of Iowa State University's Masters of Science in Horticulture. I'm also a lecturer at the ISU College of Design, and I am a very enthusiastic gardener, as you can tell by that photo. Pretty much nothing makes me happier. And I don't know about you guys, but I am pretty excited to put March behind us and get into true spring, right? So let's start with who are the pollinators? Who are we making these gardens for, right? They are the bees and the butterflies, the beetles, the wasps, the moths, the flies, hummingbirds, and even bats all play an important role as animal pollinators, insect pollinators in our world. And so why do we need them? 35% of the world's food crops depend on pollinators. So that's approximately 1 in every 3 bites that we eat. And the work of insect pollinators in US agriculture is valued at $27 billion, according to the USDA. That's equal to about 10% of Iowa's GDP in 2024, just to give you an idea. And in addition to all of those sort of why we need them reasons, there's also the fact that 85% of the world's flowering plants depend on pollinators to survive. And in turn, they create forage habitat and contribute to healthy ecosystems. And I think it's important to remember when we talk about things in sort of a conservation, sustainability setting, that we remember that we are nature too. Humans are part of the natural ecosystem, and we benefit from having healthy ecosystems around us too, and we contribute to that. So I think I want to remind people that we're not the problem necessarily. We are part of those healthy ecosystems too, especially as gardeners. So why pollinators need us? 1 in 5 native North American pollinators are at elevated risk of extinction. Our native bees are the most at risk. 1/3 of native bee species are threatened. Butterflies have declined by 22% over the last 20 years, and 1/3 of bumblebee species have experienced major range contractions. But it's not all bad news. I've got a quote here from some researchers at the University of Illinois. Our study shows that it is not necessary for a gardener to have a large garden to provide pollinators with a large supply of nectar, because it is how they choose to garden which is most important. I think that's really exciting. We don't all have the space or the ability or the finances or the time to build large gardens, but we can still make a difference even in a small garden. And Scientists out of the UK have found that urban gardeners provide an abundant supply of food for crucial pollinators. A study published in the Journal of Applied Ecology further promotes this claim, showing that urban gardens have even higher flora diversity than most natural habitats. Pollinators are one of the easiest groups of declining animals to support in a residential landscape, since even small spaces have the potential to meet the most basic needs of its entire life cycle. And even simple changes to our landscaping can make a huge difference for these animals. So again, like, yes, there's a problem, but don't be discouraged because we can really have a positive impact on this problem. And here in the Midwest, this is sort of a special problem for us. So most of the significant declines in pollinators are happening in the Southwest, largely because that's where species diversity is the highest and habitat loss has been most impactful. But we have some special species here in the Midwest that really need our support. Monarch butterflies, I think we all know and cherish our monarch butterflies, and we know that they are very much threatened. And bumblebees, especially the rusty patch bumblebee, is another Midwestern native pollinator that really needs support. And then we also have some unique reasons why in the Midwest we need to do a little more and try a little harder. Um, Less than 1% of tallgrass prairie remains, and Iowa in particular has the most altered landscape of any state in the union. We have changed so much of what would normally have been here if we had not sort of had to embrace large scale row crop agriculture in the way that we have. And so because of that, there's just not a lot of space left for these creatures. So there's some unique, like I said, unique reasons why we need to help. And then also just keeping in mind that large scale agriculture does threaten habitat and it introduces pesticides. So it also feeds a lot of people and it is a very important part of our economy, but we can do our part to kind of offset some of those negatives. And then a little bit about Midwest natives, right? A pollinator garden will always lean heavily on native plant species to support native insects. Just remember that they have co-evolved and they support one another. And the good news is that natives are typically a little lower maintenance and they're more tolerant of our weather extremes than non-natives. And that's important because, here in the upper Midwest, we do experience pretty extreme weather a lot. We have um, very cold weather, we have very hot weather, we have periods of drought, we have periods of very high rainfall. Um, we have very strong winds, and all of those things can impact how well a pollinator survives, and it can also impact how well a plant survives. And as gardeners, you know that. And that's one of the reasons why leaning hard on the native plants to build your pollinator garden really makes a lot of sense. So to talk a little bit about designing a pollinator garden, what are the steps? How do we go about doing that? And the first thing is a site assessment. And then we look at plant choices. We talk about how to structure the garden. And then sort of the little amenities we might add to make the garden even more hospitable for our pollinator friends. And then the maintenance or the management of the garden. And I like to use the word management just because maintenance suggests that we're going to keep it the same. And managing it means we're sort of keeping an eye on it, but we are seeing it change and grow and diversify. Um, so I'm going to go through those steps with you now. Let's see. So the first thing is that site assessment piece, right? You need to understand what the sun and shade profile are. Most of our pollinator host plants, especially, really do like a sunny garden. That's where they're going to do the best. So if you can, finding a sunny spot, or at least a spot that gets a few good solid hours of sun a day. Looking at the soil type is important. Heavy clay soils are going to need probably some amending or some careful plant selection. Sandy soil, the same. Most of Iowa is a pretty nice, loamy, beautiful black soil like you see in the photo on the left, right? And we're pretty lucky here to have that as our sort of standard soil. And for those of you who don't have it, I'm sorry to remind you that you're sort of in the minority, but you've probably figured out how to garden anyway. Um, and then thinking about drainage because you don't want to be trying to plant these plants somewhere where they're going to get inundated with water that's just going to sit, or somewhere where there's going to be a lot of runoff coming at them and just washing away the sort of ground layer. This is especially important because there are a lot of pollinators that actually create their habitat. They do their nesting at the ground level. So inviting them in and then flooding them out is kind of rude, if you will. It's just sort of setting them up for failure, and we don't want to do that. So looking at all those things, and then also considering the surrounding landscape. So looking at what is the threat of pesticide drift, right? So maybe you don't ever spray pesticides, but if you have a site nearby you that is regularly being treated with chemical, and you know that the wind often blows from that site towards your own, you might want to reconsider placing a pollinator garden in that sort of path, because it would be, again, pretty insensitive to those little creatures and probably doom your pollinator garden to be all show and no go. Um, Also looking at nearby roadways, interestingly enough, there's been some studies done that have shown that actually planting those pollinator gardens along roadways and sort of busy spaces along our highways, that kind of thing, can help to reduce insect mortality. So it seems like you're just drawing them into where the cars are rushing by, but actually what's happening is that you are providing sort of a safe space for them to collect and live that doesn't require that they fly out across busy roadways and get smashed onto car windshields. Um, I think that's an interesting little fact that's sort of counterintuitive. You wouldn't necessarily think that that's the case, but the Iowa DOT has done some studies and determined that actually those planted roadways are really protecting our pollinators, even though they are right along the roadways. Um, and then the other thing to think about are sort of corridors, especially migratory corridors for our monarch butterflies, for migrating small birds, particularly the hummingbirds. You want to think about, are there ways that you can position your pollinator garden to act as a sort of refuge along those migrations in those corridors? Because that would be another reason to plant a pollinator garden, and maybe a reason to talk to some of your neighbors or people who live down the road from you about how they might want to add one too, and sort of building that sort of series of way stations for pollinators. And then there is the part where you get to choose the plants, which everybody loves, right? Plant choices for a pollinator garden. So natives are great. Like I said, there's a lot of reasons to choose natives. They are not all created equal for the pollinator or for the home garden. Some of our native grasses and sedges in particular are really primarily wind pollinated, and so they don't really offer a lot for our insect pollinators or small birds and bats. Um, on the other hand, some of our beautiful natives, this is the Rudbeckia maxima, which is a plant I absolutely love. And it's a beautiful, really big plant, and it just doesn't always fit in a small garden. So thinking about like what makes sense for the home garden also. Some native plants really need the push and pull and the competition of a large space in order for them to really thrive and survive and not become not sort of outcompete everything else, and then you're left with this situation where you planted a whole garden of natives, but two or three of the biggest bossiest ones took over, And now you've gone from having this amazing species diversity to really just having one or two and being really no different than your neighbor who has turf grass and two flowering shrubs out front, as far as opportunity and diversity in your home garden. So just checking that you're choosing native plants that really are suited for the size of the site, is important. I worked on a garden. I've worked on it for a couple of years now, sort of rescuing a garden that was planted in natives, and the native Indian hemp just completely took over. And that was the only plant in the garden, and it took up a quarter of a city block. But it just didn't have enough competition to really be able to be kept in check. So just sort of knowing and taking some time to learn about, well, which plants do make the most sense as natives. Don't just assume because it's a native, it definitely makes sense for you to put in your pollinator garden. And then there's the phenomenon called nativars. Nativars are cultivated versions of our native species. So they are not true natives, but they are not exotics either. And some are great and others are pretty much useless for pollinators. So a really good example is within the world of hydrangeas, the hydrangea arborescens, is a native hydrangea. The cultivar Invincibelle lace on the right is an absolute pollinator magnet. The Mount Cuba Center did some studies on this plant that came back and showed that it is a wonderful food source for pollinators. The cultivar Annabelle, shown at the top there, which is one you see a lot, is pretty much useless for our native pollinators. It's a sterile plant. It does not produce nectar or pollen in any kind of quantity. And really, like, yes, it can provide some cover and maybe a little bit of habitat, but it is not a useful food source. So, figuring out with the cultivars of natives, the nativars, which ones make the most sense for our pollinators is an important step. And then there are exotics. So, exotics are not invasives, okay, or not necessarily invasives. I tell people, think of it like the geometry riddle that a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. Exotics are the rectangles, invasives are the squares. So an invasive is always an exotic, but an exotic is not always an invasive. And some exotic plants do well in our landscapes here in the Midwest, and they are not a threat to our native plants and our native ecosystems, but they do provide some really valuable food sources for pollinators. And being a purist about natives only is, unfortunately, it means sort of withholding some really valuable potential food sources from our hungry insects. And I think what I want to say about that is that I very much respect the work that's being done in prairie restoration and habitat restoration. But what I am talking about is home gardens, and home gardens are not the same as restoring prairie or restoring native ecosystems. We are living in a world in which our landscapes are altered and our climate is changing. And some of what might have been our sort of key native species for supporting our native pollinators are maybe not fully adequate in a place where spring comes on faster and hotter than it ever did before, and winter can um, snap in at sort of a moment's notice, and summers are hotter and maybe drier or sometimes wetter than they ever were before. And so giving the pollinators some opportunities beyond our natives is actually a really generous act for them. You just want to be thoughtful about which choices you're making. Look into it, make sure you know that you're not choosing something that is going to be a problem plant and invasive. The ones that I'm showing here are the dahlias, which are, as many of you know, a labor of love to keep, but they are also a wonderful plant for our bumblebees. They just love the nectar. They love getting into those petals and sort of nesting away in there. They can hide in them. And the plant on the right is a plant called calamint nepeta. Um, it's a absolute bee magnet. You cannot believe how many bees love this plant. And there is a man, Thomas Rayner, who is one of the authors of a book called Planting in a Post-Wild World, which is one of my personal favorite garden books. And he talks about this plant and how valuable it is to pollinators and how easy it is to keep in the home garden. And it's so well behaved and it blooms forever. And it's just covered in little buzzy bees the whole time. And so I just, I love this plant and I would encourage everyone to think about adding it to their garden if they're building a pollinator garden, even though it's not one of our beautiful Iowa natives. And then when it comes to making plant choices, I would like to remind you to think about bloom time. You really want to make sure that you are providing some kind of forage for our native pollinators from the very early spring to the end of fall. The photo on the right, you see those just that little purple aster in there among all that fall foliage. Again, a plant that will be covered in pollinators at that time of year just because there are so many fewer choices for them. And then I also put the rose in there because I want to remind you guys that roses are one of those plants that just it fills some of the gaps. There are times in, the end of June, for example, where it seems like very little is happening in the garden, sort of one of those rest points. And so a rose bush is a really great way to add something flowering that produces a nectar and a pollen source uh, in those pause moments. We worry a lot about the early spring and the late fall, but also looking at just sort of what's happening in those sort of quiet moments in the garden in between the big seasonal blooms. And I think roses are a good plant to sort of solve for that. All right, then we'll talk a little about garden structure. And this slide is a little bit busy. I apologize, but what I want to say here is in general, we want to try to offer a layered garden to our pollinators, okay? It offers more protection, it gives them nesting opportunities, and hooray for us, it reduces maintenance. And so when I talk to my garden clients about what this means, I describe it as you want a quilt, not a gallery. So if you think about an art gallery and you think about like walking into a gallery and every piece of art has its own little plinth to sit on or its own section of wall to exist in. And the space around it is this beautiful, pure, clean, white or clear wood, very restful for the eye. They're beautiful and they're really hard to maintain. My sister used to work as an art handler, and I can tell you that they spend a lot of time repainting those white walls around every single painting every time they change an exhibit. And the same is true in the garden. When you have the garden set like the one on the left, where you have the plant and you have the field of mulch around the plant, what ends up happening is that you're constantly sort of fighting to maintain that, right? The weeds creep in, you've got to get them out. You can see the weeds in the photo there, right? They're very obvious because there is this space around each plant. And that's what I call a gallery garden. And for a pollinator garden, we don't want that. We want a quilt. We want a garden where every single piece knocks up against another piece. And that is, one plant may or may not be as beautiful as the next plant, but together they create this beautiful piece of art, this beautiful moment. Um, and I like to think of each of the quilt blocks is like, it's like a group of plants that you can put together that will make a space for easy forage for the insects. So you might group a species together, put a little clump of three echinacea together, right? And then that creates a little block in your quilt. And then you might have another, right next to that, you might have three rudbeckia. and that's the next, or 5 Rudbeckia, and that's the next block. And you put the blocks together and you smash them all up next to each other and you don't leave gaps. And that's what creates this quilt garden effect. And when you build a quilt, if you are a quilter, you know this, your quilt has a border around it. And the border around your quilt is what holds everything sort of together, and it protects the work of the quilting and the patchwork um, as you sort of throw the blanket around and do things with it and live with it. And the same is true with the border in your garden. The border protects your plants from some of the wind damage, and it gives your plants a little sort of a little buffer from the lawnmower and from string trimmers. And it gives you just a little bit more, it gives your pollinators a little sort of buffer zone before they have to worry about being in the lawn, right? And then the other thing I like to remind you is that a quilt has a backing layer, right? The back of the quilt that everybody sort of forgets about. But it's very important and it sort of holds everything together. And the same is true in the quilt garden. You have all these ground cover plants that come together and they knit together and they create the backing layer, the sort of underlayer beneath the beautiful quilt blocks or the beautiful plants. And that's what I'm trying to show you in the bottom right photo. Those are all tiny little flat plants that just sort of live underneath, and it's easy enough to forget that they're even there. But they do provide some protection, and they sort of hold things together, and they keep the weeds from getting a little too in there, which is really nice. So thinking about the garden as having structure, right? A backing layer, being knit together, grouping the plants, having some different heights that the plants can sort of the pollinators can hide in. Things like that are really valuable. So I just want to encourage you to try to build your garden a little bit messy and know that it will be quite beautiful. And then you have to add the amenities. This is so much fun. I like to think of these as the little extras that make the pollinator garden a little more inviting, like you're upgrading from a Motel 6 to a Four Seasons. So add bird baths and then add corks to them, which means you get to drink more wine, right? You need to. It's for the bees. The corks help the bees to get to the water without drowning. That's a real problem for little insects, and they get thirsty, and it's a really nice way to invite them in. Another option is to add bee houses, and you can go online and you can buy a bee house, or you can find instructions to make your own bee house. But especially for our mason bees that need little holes to nest in, these can be a really valuable little addition. Leaving sticks and little piles of wood around in your garden creates habitat for pollinators. And then you've got to plant some host plants, especially the milkweed for our monarchs, right? And then there's the maintenance or the management of your pollinator garden. So first off, water regularly for establishment, okay? I suggest generally you're going to water every week for the first month, or twice a week for the first month, and then weekly for about the first calendar year. You don't water when it's, the middle of January and everything's frozen. But generally speaking, for that first year, the plants are vulnerable to drought, and you want to just make sure they're getting what they need to survive. After that, they should have their roots down and you don't have to worry about them so much. Um, Also remember that, if it's very windy, very hot, they might need a little extra water. And also if it's rained a lot recently, they don't need as much. But you're gardeners, you know that. And then the other thing is leave the leaves. Please leave the leaves and the sticks and the seed heads. Keep your fall cleanup to an absolute minimum, and wait as long as you can in the spring to start cleanup, because this is where so many of our native pollinators are hibernating. They are overwintering in your untidy garden. And it is one of the best little gifts you can give them is to give them that space to get through the winter in. All right. And then also, this seems obvious, but don't use pesticides. Let those bugs make love and make more bugs all over your garden. Deal with invasive insects using some soapy water and a lot of patience, where you knock the bugs into the soapy water and they drown in it. Or just ignore them. A lot of them are not actually going to be that big of a threat. The Japanese beetles make a mess of things, but they don't actually kill stuff. It's okay. And then weed. yes, this garden still needs weeding. That's how you keep the invasive plants in check. And also look out for overly aggressive plants, and you can check them by dividing them and giving some away. You can deadhead them so that they don't seed out, or you can just rip them out. But, keep an eye on that because there will be some overly aggressive plants that will try to take over. Um, and you don't want that. You want to keep that diversity up. All right, now I'm going to share a couple of case studies. The first one is this home. It's a Habitat for Humanity home in Northeast Des Moines. I designed the garden for this, and it is maintained by the homeowner, Shirley Trainer. It is a massive home garden, a giant vegetable patch, stormwater capture throughout the entire property. And also, she hosts honeybee hives for the honeybee club at a local high school here in Des Moines. Um, so it's a very lively, beautiful space. And I like to start out by showing you, this is what it looked like when we first started. Shortly after she purchased the home, she called me and said, I would like to put a garden in here. And it was, yeah, it was a real effort. We pulled up the sod, we put in all these different plants. Some of which were purchased, some of which were donated, some of which she started from seed herself. And it is an incredibly welcoming space. She hosted a garden tour in 2022, so just a year later. You can see how all those plants have started to come in. And then a picture there of just the front garden in full bloom. So we went from, if you remember here, this is how the house looked in the beginning. And this is what it looks like today. So it's a pretty impressive garden effort that she's doing there. And it is a wonderful space for pollinators. Like I said, she's even hosting the local school's bee club. And then this one is Coles Commons in downtown Des Moines. This garden was designed by Kelly Norris at the Public Horticulture Company, and it is maintained by Young Gardens, which is my garden landscape company. And this is a public garden. It's an event space, and it exists in a highly urban context. So you can see here, I pulled this map for you. So you can just see like it is these little pockets all around this big red strip down the middle are the gardens. And then it is just hemmed in on all sides by urban infrastructure. Okay, it's a city block worth of garden, and it is absolutely beautiful and just hums with bees and birds and bugs all the time. It's just a few blocks from the Des Moines River, so it also acts as a refuge for migratory birds and insects as they come through downtown Des Moines. In that urban context, there are a lot of people there. There's a lot of pressure on that garden. There's a lot of temptation to sort of step through the garden on your way somewhere to get kind of, if there's a big event happening in that space, people might sort of spill out and stand on the plants if they don't understand that this is a garden. And so really intentional planting and really colorful flowers really help to sort of give people those cues to care, right? So they have no doubt that this is a garden. This is not just sort of unused space, and that this is a space that has intention behind it. And man, does it brings in so many bees and bugs. It's amazing. So there's another photo of it there. All right, and I'll just talk really quickly about starting your own pollinator garden. I just have a few tips and suggestions to maximize success when you start out building a home for pollinators at your home. So first of all, you can start small. Even a few potted plants on your stoop can make a difference for hungry pollinators, and I think that's really empowering to know. And a small garden is a great place to start, or even just integrating more pollinator-friendly species into your existing garden. Finding some things that fill the gaps in bloom time can really make your existing garden more inviting to a pollinator. I know sourcing plants can be stressful, especially natives. I recommend trying your local farmers markets. A lot of times there are options there, especially in the spring. Also, Facebook Marketplace is a great place to connect with people who are starting plants and selling them off. And then don't be afraid to just ask at your local nursery. Just because they don't have it doesn't mean they can't get it. And oftentimes they're very willing to if you're excited about it. And I would also really encourage you to consider annuals as part of the mix. They have just amazing flower power, right? And you can acquire annual seeds cheaply and you can grow them easily from seed. And just there have been some studies that have shown that annual flowers, really, especially in the late fall for bumblebees that are active until really very late in the season, can really help them to have the food sources they need right up through the end of the season. And then the other thing I'll tell you is that you should engage with some of the citizen scientist opportunities like the Monarch Watch and Bumblebee Watch and iNaturalist, because they give you opportunities to connect your efforts to a larger community. The Monarch Way Station opportunities within Monarch Watch are a great example of that. And they also give you a chance to both give and receive support from other people who are doing this work. And gardens are community builders, and so why not take advantage of that? And then I want to have a little note about No Mow May, because I think it's important to talk about that quickly. So No Mow May is an effort to preserve foraging opportunities for pollinators at the start of spring when they are vulnerable because of limited food sources. And it makes a lot of sense, but it originates in England, where the climate and seasonal changes are significantly different than they are here in Iowa. Dandelions are natives, and spring starts slower and cooler than it does here in the Midwest. So instead of No Mow May, our friends at ISU Extension would encourage us all to embrace a mow less May, where you mow maybe every 2 weeks. And also depending on how early spring starts and how quickly temperatures climb, it might make more sense to think of it as mow less April, which is less catchy, but perhaps more relevant. And you just don't want to let invasives take over your landscape while while you're not mowing. And you also need, once the dandelions and the creeping Charlie are valuable pollinator food sources, but once your flowers start blooming, like the ones that you put in your pollinator garden start to flower, then you don't need to worry about having those. You'll be providing a food source for our pollinators that way. So just be cautious with the No Mow May. It can be a little overwhelming for the Iowa landscape. And finally, I want to just remind you all that you can make a difference. Your pollinator garden can protect species from the disturbances caused by the climate crisis, by being more diverse even than our natural ecosystem, by offering plants that flower earlier in the spring and later into fall. You can contribute to the health of our ag-driven economy here in Iowa with your pollinator garden. Pollinators make a huge difference in the success of our soybean crops and also a lot of our more specialty crops here in Iowa. You can help restore lost habitat for our pollinators, and you can build community interest and engagement with the threats to pollinators. So you can, when you put in a pollinator garden and the bugs start coming and you start talking to your neighbors about it and talking to your friends about it and telling the kids that are fascinated by all those bugs in your garden about why you're doing it and why it matters, you are building community and you are helping people understand what the threats to pollinators are. And so take advantage of your chance to really make a difference. And that's the end of my presentation. I am happy to answer questions about pollinator gardens for you guys. I do also have at the very end here just a plant list of some of my most favorite pollinator plants for the home garden. So most of these are natives, not all of them. Things that you might consider adding to your garden. Just thought I'd throw that up there for you. I'm here and I can answer questions.
One of the ones I'm going to start with, because one of you you kind of already answered it, but I want to see if you would like a chance to expand upon it. Someone asked about if it's possible to put a pollinator garden in a public space, which you proved it is with your Cowles Commons example. But can you talk to us besides those cues of care? Are there other things that you would say are keys to being successful with a pollinator garden in a public space, especially when we're thinking about the public reaction or perception of bees and wasps and stingy things flying around in spaces that they are also trying to enjoy?
Yes, absolutely. I think so education is just key, absolutely key here. The big things I would encourage are consider getting some signage that explains what you're doing because you aren't going to be there to tell people. If you put a pollinator garden next to your patio, you can tell your friends when they come over and have a barbecue at your house why there are bees nearby and why they don't need to worry. But you're not going to be hanging out at the public garden all the time telling people. So I think signage is really helpful if you can figure out a way to do that. Make sure you're communicating with anybody else who interacts with the space regularly about what you're doing and why, and making sure that they understand, like, please don't use pesticides nearby. Please don't try to clean this all up, at the very first sign of snow. Um, a lot of times people are very well-meaning and they want to help, but they don't necessarily understand that it could be detrimental to the success. Um, Also, I think if you're in public spaces, sometimes it's just a good idea to see if there are other organizations you can network with, right? Like local schools, local churches. There's just sometimes it just helps to have like another organization that's part of that because you do have to stay on top of that maintenance and those keeping it sort of clear that it is a cared for space, right? Does that
Yeah,
help?
that's great. Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
No
Also, you talked
problem.
about waiting to clean up in the spring, which is something that we talk about frequently with caring for pollinators and inviting them into our space. But people have a hard time figuring out when exactly is it time to clean up. Do you have any signs or like tried and true methods of telling when it's time to start cleaning up in the spring?
Well, I mean, I'm a gardener too. So part of it is just wait as long as you can, because there's going to come a moment where you just can't wait any longer and you have to get out there and start doing it. But watch for the bugs. They'll tell you that they've come out because they'll be out. Um, and they come out pretty soon. Like they come out pretty early. Just watching for them, seeing them come out. But also, there are things you can do where you're cleaning up, but you're not necessarily taking away. You're not necessarily putting it in the green bin, taking it to the compost. Maybe it's just sort of pushed into a back corner for now as you're starting the process. And then, that gives those insects a chance to find their way out before you send it all off to the compost bin. Um, Otherwise, just kind of watching the temperatures really, the warmer temperatures, the sunny days. That's gonna be it's not the best answer. I'm sorry.
But the consistent warm, sunny days, like,
Yeah,
all of us who experienced how it was 75 degrees on Monday and then
and
drove
then it
through a
snowed.
snowstorm the other day,
Yeah,
that's not consistent. So we want to see some
no.
consistency.
Yeah, and start watching for them. They'll, when they start coming out, when they start buzzing around, then like, okay, they're out. It's okay. And watch for that forage. They're not going to come out if there's nothing to eat, right? They're not going to break their hibernation before there's anything to eat. So waiting to see some of those plants starting to flower, whether it's your daffs or your tulips or violets, that kind of thing. Those are the ones that they are looking for to eat. So
Yeah. And then you also talked about having monarch way stations, or sorry, you didn't specifically say monarch, but
I
way
did.
stations and other, making those way stations for pollinators, using those as talking points and community builders and a way to connect people to talk about these subjects, which, sometimes people can be divided. If they come and they see a yard and they say, that doesn't look like what I think a yard should look like, it looks very messy. So someone was asking, what other ideas do you have for talking to people about how they can accept these gardens and yards that look messier than they would assume a turf grass lawn should look?
So this is something I learned from my husband who loves turf. Loves turf. Lifelong golfer. His brother's a golf course maintenance guy, turf guy. Having careful, well-mown lawns that look nice and are cared for and carefully edged, you can have a really chaotic garden if the part that you walk by at the sidewalk has a really nice, clean, crisp edge on it. Um, thinking about that border space is really huge. Thinking about what can I plant along the edges of my garden that give a clear signal that this is the edge of the garden. Um, Staying away, like thinking about, especially if it's like along a sidewalk, making sure things aren't falling onto the sidewalk. People get very anxious about plants that feel like they're reaching out at them. And especially if those plants have, bees all over them. So making sure that we're sort of situating the sort of taller, floppier plants back a little ways from the edge, giving the garden a really just clean, clear border. Um, you can even go so far as like boxwoods, right? Like you could put boxwoods along the front of the garden and or um, a little if you want to go with more of like a native um like a chokecherry hedge, an aronia can help. But really, like if you just keep the edges tidy and you keep the grass nice, like you keep your grass mown nice and short and tidy where you have grass, that really does help ease people's anxiety about this stuff. And then I can't tell you how much giving people flowers will soften them. I have a neighbor who was very suspicious of all the crazy plants in my front yard for a long time. And then I started sending her little kids home with big handfuls of bouquets. And she's now got one of her own in her front yard. So, um, you know, diplomacy through flowers.
That's a great tip. It's like attracting more flies with honey, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, great. So you were talking about, you just named a few like native tree bush species,
Mhm.
and that leads us to another question that someone was wondering if there are trees that are beneficial to pollinators that are also beautiful that you would suggest people put in their landscapes.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, trees are really valuable for, even if they are not particularly valuable for food source, they are a really good shelter. There are a lot of insects that do really well in sort of burrowing into sort of the edges of bark, and there are some insects that actually use birds' nests as their own nests. Um, so that's really helpful. The other thing is bats are a really important part of our pollinator equation, and they need trees. So all your trees are going to be valuable. Oaks have been proven to be particularly valuable as far as big trees go. Um, for smaller, more ornamental trees that are going to be a real benefit to our pollinators, I would really encourage you to look at our redbuds, which are nice, beautiful, early blooming, and our native dogwoods. They are another one. And then the crab apples are, I guess, our other like kind of beautiful flowering, early flowering native.
Okay, great. And then we have a few questions that kind of go together, so I'm going to
Mhm.
group them together so that we can answer those. This one, I think you already answered, but I'm going to let you answer it again. And I think you had a great analogy. You had that geometry analogy where you're talking about squares and rectangles. So someone asked, do you have, or sorry, is there a difference between exotics and ornamentals?
I guess I honestly, ornamentals to me are all of the plants that are part of the horticulture world, right? They're the plants that we plant because they're beautiful. They're the plants that we have some emotional attachment to, that we feel like belong in a garden, belong in our home landscapes. And I think that ornamentals can is sort of a subjective category because what I feel is a beautiful plant that I want in my landscape because I have childhood memories of it, or because I love the color, or I love the scent, or I think it's a beautiful shape, might be different than what someone else chooses. But a lot of our natives can be ornamental plants, right? They work really well in that context. And then some of our natives don't really work particularly well in that context. Some of them are just, they are too big, they're too aggressive, they don't feel friendly, they don't feel scaled appropriately for a home landscape. And so I think that's kind of how I would make that distinction. And then as far as the exotics go, generally speaking, you're not going to find exotics here that are not also ornamentals, unless maybe you're looking at like food crops. Um, Otherwise, if it's available to you here and it's not native, it's almost certainly an exotic that is an ornamental.
Yeah, I think that was a great way to describe it because, yeah, ornamental, that's such a broad category, right? It's like on social media right now, we're doing March Madness and we're doing showy perennials because we couldn't say just perennials because what does that mean, right? So we had to choose specifically. We want to do ones with showy flowers. Yeah, an ornamental can be anything that is, as it says, ornamental and is something that you keep around for its beauty and its aesthetics. And thinking of those ornamentals and those specifically the exotics, you had said there are some exotics that are beneficial to our pollinators. You gave a few examples, and someone was wanting to know if you had any more examples of some exotics that are particularly beneficial.
Gosh, I wish that I could say that I did. I think daylilies are probably one that I didn't mention that are pretty useful. They're another one that just like the bloom time, easy access to nectar makes them really useful. Um, that would be probably the other one that comes to mind immediately. Some of our bulb plants too, the stuff that's going to bloom here really soon, like the daffodils and the tulips, and those can be really, really pretty beneficial too.
Great.
And I guess I don't know about their native origins, but I don't think of them as natives.
Yeah. Well, and then you also talked about this idea of a quilt garden and how you're, weaving things together. And we had a lot of quilters that were very happy to see that analogy in
I'm so
there.
glad.
But someone was asking, the quilt garden idea leads them to think maybe that is susceptible to powdery mildew and other diseases from restricted airflow. So what would you say about, either can you say, is it susceptible to those things? Or what are some tips that you would tell someone for using that method, but still trying to cut back on disease pressure?
So truthfully, um, this is how plants grow in real life for the most part, right? Plants grow close to each other. Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you are not vigilant in your gallery garden, keeping the weeds out, they will fill in those spaces, or the plants will get bigger and fill in those spaces. So really, I can definitely understand the concern about powdery mildew, and it seems like that would be a real issue. But really, if you keep the plants healthy, and honestly, this usually means watering them, you will be surprised at how well they will handle being kind of close together. Now, there are some plants that will get crowded out, and if you have absolute treasured favorites, I happen to love the blue-eyed grass. It's one of my favorite plants. Um, but I have to plant it right along the edges of my garden because it just gets overpowered and lost so quickly in my very chaotic quilt garden. Um, so just, like if you have those plants that are particularly dear to you, placing them somewhere where you will remember to check on them and remember to sort of clear things back and give them space will make a difference. And then just being, take the time that you used to spend pulling all those weeds and use it to sort of check your plants for insects, that are causing damage or disease, and spend a little time, cutting back things that are looking a little like, oh, this has got a little bit of disease in it. Let's get it out of here. That sort of thing.
Great. And then along with that same line of thought, when you were talking about the quilt garden, you were talking about your favorite backing, or you were talking about backing slash matrix plants. And
Mhm.
people were wanting to know what are your favorite plants for that specific,
Oh,
part of the
oh
quilt.
yeah. I'm gonna flip back so we can look at
Yeah,
it because that is that is something I really love to think about. Um, so down here, this is plantain. Um it's a native plantain, and uh what is the common name for it? It's a pussy toes. And it's great. I love it. This is the native petunia over here on the far right there. That's another one that does really well. I have some creeping thyme that I use a lot. Um, all those put up beautiful little flowers that are really helpful. I like using heucheras as sort of a ground layer too. They're a little bigger, a little bossier. They're not going to work everywhere. But I do quite like those. Um, Sedges are great. The pen sedge is a great one. What else do I love for a ground cover layer? My backing layers. Missouri primrose is a beautiful native that makes a good backing layer also. Um, but really, the other thing to keep in mind is like these are all really important as the garden gets started, but eventually they're going to get crowded out unless they're right along the edges. Like you'll see in this one, you can just barely see on that far right corner. You can see where the concrete is. This is right along the sidewalk in my garden. And you'll also see my blue-eyed grass there that I'm protecting. But those, those are the areas that remain sort of open and really need that backing layer still. As the other plants have gotten bigger, they have crowded out a lot of that and shaded it out. So, um, don't be scared.